We have two speakers for this evening. You see their names up here, preserving and protecting Galveston Bay for generations to come. And Ricci has a BS in wildlife and fishery sciences and a BS in rangeland ecology from Texas A&M and College Station, and an MS in hydrology from Boise State University. She has an interest in preservation of nature, and this began as a young child on her grandfather's ranch. Originally, she began her educational journey studying herpetology, but along the way, she was driven to understand vegetation and its hydrologic impacts on the regional water budget in the Pacific Northwest. As time will tell, she became a specialist in vegetation management and continues down this path of improving her botanical skills. She is the conservation stewardess technician at Galveston Bay Foundation. Her responsibility there is to promote species diversity, improve hydrologic function, and increase wildlife habitat through vegetation management on protected lands that are sensitive to the health of Galveston Bay. She also oversees the monitoring of the Galveston Bay Foundation properties using the Land Trust Alliance standards and practices. Her interests are botany and vegetation inventory. Ricci spends most of her free time enjoying the outdoors with her family, and especially loves collecting and pressing botanical specimens. Our other speaker is Haille, and she has a BS in Ocean and Coastal Resources from Texas A&M at Galveston, and a Master's of Coastal Zone Management from NOAA SC University out of Florida. She grew up hiking and constantly on the water with her family, and she loved nature from the very, very beginning. She actually had several trips to the Florida Keys as part of summer camp as a teenager and fell in love with the mangroves and, of course, scuba diving. She was amazed that none of her classes in school even mentioned mangroves and their importance, so she was determined to learn more. Pursued environmental science in college and ended up in South Florida, and had a master's which actually focused on the mangrove management and protection, and had a publication in a journal. Haille joined the Galveston Bay Foundation in March 2015. Prior to joining GBF, she worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the Galveston District and in private industry as an environmental consultant. She has a passion for coastal conservation and is excited to restore and preserve the wetlands and the oyster reefs in and around Galveston Bay. And I wanted to point out that she recently had an article in the Houston Chronicle, and I love this title, "We Have Much to Learn from the Humble Oyster." And it's a really good article. I suggest you read it. So, Ricci and Haille, take it away.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was an excellent introduction. Okay, well, as Helen said, I'm Haille Leija with the Galveston Bay Foundation, and Ricci Simmons is also here with me today. We're both part of our conservation team there at the foundation, and so we wanted to give you a little bit of information on how we use native plants to help with restoration around the Galveston Bay area. All right, so I will get us started off here and then hand it over to Ricci a little bit later on. So in case you're not familiar with the Galveston Bay Foundation, we are a local nonprofit based in the Houston region. Our headquarters is actually in Kemah now. We are very fortunate to have secured 30 acres on the waterfront, and you'll see some gorgeous pictures from Ricci later on of that property. But our mission is not only to help restore and protect the natural habitats in and around Galveston Bay, but also to bring the community together and help to benefit all users of the Bay system. I always like to start with a map. In addition to being a plant nerd, I'm also a map nerd. So I like to orient everybody on where we're located. Our name, Galveston Bay Foundation, can be a bit of a misnomer. We always get asked if we work on the island. In fact, we worked all around Galveston Bay, both on land and in the water, from Baytown to Anahuac, down to Bolivar, and everywhere in between. So I just wanted to give you guys an idea of the breadth of work we do all around Galveston Bay. So we achieve our work through a variety of program areas and projects. We have an incredible education team who works with students both in the classroom and actually out in the water and the habitats to give them hands-on experience. We also have folks who work on water quality concerns and quantity concerns. We even have an advocacy team. But Ricci and I are here today to talk to you about our habitat restoration efforts and our land conservation. So my role at the foundation as habitat restoration manager mainly focuses on the specific habitat restoration projects. So these can range from restoring bird rookeries to creating oyster reef. But since y'all are the Native Plant Society, I wanted to focus on our marsh restoration and shoreline protection today because that involves a very important local native species. So just to give you a little background, the Galveston Bay system as an estuary has lost over 30,000 acres of our wetland habitat, and that combines both fresh and saltwater wetlands. And as I'm sure many of you know, this is an incredibly important habitat, not only for a variety of species that use it as a nursery grounds, a lot of our recreational and commercial species that are very important to the industry originate in our marshes and freshwater wetlands. And they also help, these habitats help with flooding, not only absorbing those floodwaters and reducing flood risks, but also helping to filter upland runoff into the bay system. And so it's actually been identified by a lot of the folks who research this area that habitat degradation is one of the main issues facing this estuary. So that's why it's one of the key focuses of the Galveston Bay Foundation is to get out here and actually restore this habitat on the ground. So I come into play, my job in the intertidal zone, essentially. So most of my work is in the water, where you can see these red rectangles on the screen here. And so most of the plants that I work with are going to be the species that grow in that range. And predominantly, we work with smooth cordgrass. It's also called Spartina alterniflora, although I think that scientific name has recently switched to Spirabolus, but maybe some of you plant folks know better than I do. And this is the species that we predominantly work with. And the reason that we utilize Spartina alterniflora is because it is a species that grows right there on the fringe, right at the water's edge. It is actually salt tolerant. It does not need salt, but it can handle it. It actually can extrude that salt from spores in its stem. And it's really strong and flexible, so it can handle all the wind and wave action that comes with the storms that our region sees. It also has these incredible roots and rhizomes that can branch out a foot and a half in any direction. So you can imagine just how much it stabilizes that sediment and can help protect the shoreline as well. And of course, as I mentioned before, it is incredibly important habitat and helps with absorbing some of those floodwaters that we experience pretty often here. And I always love this diagram because you can really see how those roots can spread out and stabilize not only the plant itself, but the surrounding sediment. So we are very fortunate at Galveston Bay Foundation to have a nursery to grow out this particular species amongst many others. This is a partnership that has been long in the making, and the foundation recently just took over the lease of this property. But we're in partnership with Reliant and NRCS to actually maintain these ponds, which were at one point cooling ponds for a chemical plant, but were long ago converted to be nursery habitat for growing out the Spartina alterniflora. So one of our partners from NRCS actually collects wild seed in the fall, prepares it, and then reseeds these ponds to replenish them and allow us to come out and harvest them rather than having to take native grass out in the bay and transplanting it. We just take it right from here from the nursery. And so the way we do that, we actually hop in these ponds in that nasty, mucky marsh water and grab those stems one by one, harvest them in these 32-gallon buckets. And you can see it can be some pretty messy work, but it's a lot of fun. We even get kids out there through our education programs. We have the Hip to Habitat program where students get to come out and harvest the grass, and they actually grow it out at their schools. And then they plant that grass with us in the next spring at one of our restoration sites. So they get to see the full cycle of this grass species. The way we actually utilize the Spartina in our marsh restoration is through a few different methods, and it really just depends on the site. So I wanted to give you a few examples of how this works and why we choose these different approaches. And then also from the inception of Galveston Bay Foundation back in 1907, we have created over 600 acres of marsh habitat. So one of the ways we do that is through creating these things called Marsh Mountains. And essentially all that is taking material from a borrow site and dredging it to create these areas of higher elevation. So the marsh grass has some material to grow off of. So this particular site is in Burnett Bay, and that area has experienced over 10 feet of subsidence. So it's too deep for that grass to grow. But we were able to bring some areas up to higher elevation and then come in and plant it with individual stems of that grass. And you can see in these pictures here just how quickly that flourishes. I love seeing the one on the bottom there from 2009 to 2011. In just 2 years, those mounds were completely covered in Spartina. So another similar approach, we typically call it beneficial use. So rather than dredging a canal and just having to put that material up to an upland placement area, we beneficially use it to create marsh habitat. And so the way that's done, we create ring levees to basically create these containment cells. So when that dredge material is pumped out of a channel, it can go into those containment cells, de-water, and then we come in with either the Spartina seeds or the individual stems and plant those. So again, you can see here in just a matter of a year how quickly that grass can flourish. And of course, that's dependent on all sorts of environmental conditions. And we just got very lucky at this site. We had a really great year in 2018, 2019. Now, another approach we take to not only create marsh habitat, but also to protect shorelines from erosion is what we like to call a living shoreline. So rather than putting in a bulkhead that's just straight up and down, hard concrete, steel, or wood along a shoreline and basically cutting you off from all the ecosystem benefits, we essentially will install a wave break further offshore. And that creates a calm area of water behind it where we can then restore the marsh habitat and other habitats like seagrass and oyster reefs. So in doing this, we've protected over 20 miles of shoreline. And out of those 600 acres of marsh that we've restored, 50 acres were restored through this technique. So on a larger scale, this is done with contractors and placing this riprap rock material. It's either concrete or limestone typically. So again, this is a much larger scale approach, but you can see in this picture, I always like to show this one, how quickly this sediment starts to build up right behind that rock. So essentially this is a wave break, and the wave action hits that first, slows down that water, and the sediment falls out of suspension behind it. So raising that sediment back up to a height where marsh can then flourish. So these are just some examples of this same approach from an aerial view. And you can see on the left in 2010, where there's no marsh present. And fast forward to the right side of the picture here, in 2020, you can see how dense that marsh has grown. Now, the site in the very bottom is actually one of the foundation's preserves called Shipe Woods. And I wanted to point this out because this site has been very successful and it was done completely with volunteer planting. So if you're ever interested in coming out and getting muddy with us, this is always a fun opportunity. We call it Marsh Mania, and get our volunteers out in the mud planting this grass. But you can see in the bottom right corner there, this is a perfect example of how erosive forces can just completely deteriorate a shoreline. But then over time, as we're able to reduce that wave action, bring the marsh in, that shoreline will stabilize again. And of course, we're creating beautiful marsh habitat for many species to enjoy. And this is just one more example of a recent living shoreline we created at our Trinity Bay Discovery Center in Beach City. And we've been planting this over the last year or two. And again, you can see just how quickly this grass will fill in when the conditions are right. So this is a recent picture from December, and we're already starting to see a lot of growth coming in. And we also do this on a smaller scale. So this was a local community based project. And these living shorelines can even be done in front of an existing bulkhead and still bring back some of that important marsh habitat. And of course, we love our volunteers. We couldn't do this without them. We also help landowners protect their shorelines and create additional habitat along their properties. And you can see in these pictures, they are using a different technique to break some of that wave action, but also create oyster habitat. Those are actually satcrete bags that created some calm area so the marsh can replenish and so the oysters can recruit on there. And speaking of oysters, we also use other techniques to help recruit them. So not only are you getting marsh habitat and shoreline stabilization, but you're also creating oyster habitat. And oysters, above all else, love other shells. So we actually started utilizing those shells in some of our shoreline protection techniques to create that marsh habitat and protect the shoreline. And we do this through our oyster shell recycling program, where we actually work with restaurants to reclaim their shells. So rather than those shells just going in the trash can and ending up in a landfill, we intervene and actually collect the shells directly from the restaurants. We quarantine them on land for 6 months, and then we return them to the bay through a variety of methods, but the predominant one is through using them as shoreline protection. So they're actually placed in these mesh bags and stacked in kind of a pyramid formation to make the same kind of wave break you saw with those large rocks, but on a much smaller scale. And so these are just some of our volunteers in action deploying those shell bags and new oyster growth on those old shells. And then, of course, we come back in after the construction is complete and we're able to refurbish that marsh. And you can see our volunteers here in action and one of our all-star interns. And last but not least, this, like I said before, this creates kind of a threefold benefit. You're getting both oyster habitat and marsh habitat, as well as protecting your shoreline. And you can see from some of these images, not only do fish and oysters and other critters enjoy this habitat, you have birds flocking in to feed off of these reefs. It's just kind of a full cycle, bringing all the habitat back to our shorelines. So hence the living shoreline approach. And so that's my little bit on our in the water habitat restoration portion. And so I will hand it over to Ricci. And Ricci, you just tell me when you're ready for me to advance the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Haille. My name is Ricci Simmons. I'm the Conservation Stewardship Technician of the Galveston Bay Foundation. I've been here about 1.5 years. I guess it's closer to 2 years now. And still just learning as I go and enjoying every moment of it. All right, so a little bit about Galveston Bay. We're the largest bay in Texas, the 7th largest in the nation, and 2nd most productive bay in the US. It's fed by fresh water from the San Jacinto and Trinity rivers and local bayous and creeks. Approximately half of Texans live within the Galveston Bay watershed, so that's a pretty substantial amount of people that all habitate within this watershed. So why land conservation? More than 83% of land in Texas is privately owned ranches, farms, and forests. Land fragmentation has been impacting wildlife habitat, water quantity and quality, and sustainability of agriculture for quite some time. In this map, the red areas represent the regions that have the highest conversion of natural areas to urbanization and agricultural uses. And so the Galveston Bay Foundation is what is known as an accredited land trust. It's a private nonprofit organization that, as part or all of its mission, actively seeks to conserve land and steward conservation property. A land trust can be national, statewide, regional, or local. There are 30 land trusts in Texas, and we have all protected over 1.6 million acres. So there are 2 ways that a land trust protects land. One way is fee simple properties, and the other is conservation easements. So fee simple properties are basically just title, own, and you pay taxes. You simply just own the land outright. GBF currently has 3,600 acres protected in perpetuity. And the other way that we conserve land, which is very important for us, considering that 95% of Texas is privately owned, is through the way of conservation easements. And this is a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and a land trust or another qualified entity, such as the government or a regional park. The other thing is it's an agreement that restricts future land uses of the property and protects natural and ecological qualities, or what we call conservation values. GBF only utilizes perpetual easements, and we have nearly 4,700 acres protected today, which is awesome. So this is a map of all of our properties. I think the only property that is missing is our recent acquisition of Dollar Bay in Texas City. All of the green dots are our conservation easements, and our blue dots are fee simple properties. So you can see that this is a pretty wide range. Haille mentioned it before. Most people think of, Galveston Bay Foundation, you must work in Galveston. But when you talk about, land management on a scale like between 4 counties, it's pretty substantial territory that we're covering. So a little bit about terrestrial habitat restoration on our conservation lands. So GBF does coastal prairie restoration, wetland restoration, and forestation. But first, I'll talk a little bit about why we focus on those areas and how the vegetation is so important to us. So for restoration values in wetlands, wetlands are particularly important because they uptake heavy metal pollutants into the plant material itself. They slow water movement across a landscape, which improves the hydrology and filtration. They're great sources of nutrient cycling, and they add protection from storm surges or urban flooding. For prairie and forest, they have the great ability to store carbon above and below ground. Macronutrient cycles increase the organic matter and overall soil health. They also promote soil development, which increases water retention and improves our hydrologic cycle. So this is a busy slide, but basically it's to show you how dynamic plant communities are to the various earth system processes, such as the energy budget, the hydrologic cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle. All of those, all these systems are connected in some way, and vegetation is a primary influencer. Also, this figure shows different kinds of wetlands with their associated values for wildlife habitat and flood mitigation. The Galveston Bay Foundation primarily works in estuarine and coastal wetlands, and also barrier island wetlands. But for each one of these, you can see that feeding and nesting habitat and sediment nutrient retention are all very key. And something that we don't always think about, but vegetation affects our climate a lot more than we give it credit for. More specifically, vegetation plays a major role in our climatic conditions where transpiration, or the breathing of a plant, so to speak, increases our humidity and also increases our rainfall and precipitation events, while the converse amount of bare ground and higher what they call albedo reflection of solar radiation due to lack of vegetation has less humidity and reduces precipitation overall. And I think a good example that most of us know about is the Dust Bowl from the 1930s, where agricultural practice coupled with drought caused a large negative or positive feedback loop, exacerbating climate conditions. So with that, we'll talk about some of the projects that we've done here in the Galveston Bay area. To begin with, this is our prairie restoration and a couple of our conservation easements and fee simple properties. The picture on the left is your plant of the plant of the month, the coral bean? Yes, so I was collecting a coral bean seed on an island in Galveston, and we are using that to propagate at our nursery where we do our marsh grass harvest. And the middle picture is me doing a prescribed burn last week. That's one of our conservation easements. And the picture on the right is, the very first start of our nursery grow out for our prairie and wetland restoration projects coming up this fall. So with our prairie restoration, we have on our Kemah property about an acre and a half that we were trying to restore. And first thing was like, okay, so how do I get my forbs? You can commonly find grass seed pretty easily, native grass seed, but forbs are a little bit trickier because you just really have to go out there and harvest them yourself. So I collected a small army of volunteers. Probably some of you that are in this meeting today has helped me in some way collect these I think it was close to 9 pounds of forb seeds. So we have recently planted on our Kemah property, and we've called it the Robin's Prairie. But we're also collecting for, like we had mentioned before, our Eco Center in Baytown, and that nursery's operations as well. So these are just some of the plants that we had collected. We did a lot. Yeah, and here are some other ones. I love when I find big blue stem. That's like one of my Where's Waldo's. You don't find that often. So this was the prairie, the Robin's Prairie that we're working to restore. We did have some native grass seed, distributed and drilled in after tilling it. And then we had all of those forbs that we collected from our local volunteers. And now we're just sitting back and waiting to see, you know, what's going to pop up. Because this just happened this fall, and I'm under the impression it would take probably 3 years to reach its potential, but I'm excited to see what comes up this spring. And we did some live transplants as well. So I think that's some big blue stems, switchgrass, and different things. So we would harvest from some of our local prairies. There was, in fact, one that I know some of you helped me with. It was a convenience store sign, you know, ready to be a convenience store probably in the next 3 or 4 months. And so I called the owner and was like, hey, can we harvest your seed and collect some plant material? And they allowed it. So that was a huge benefit because it was a very nice prairie. Too bad it's going to turn into a convenience store, but we salvaged it. And so next I'll talk about another prairie restoration. I work under Matt Singer, the Director of Land Conservation, and he was the one that primarily led this project. But this is one of our fee simple properties that's called Chocolate Bayou, which is sort of by Brazoria National Wildlife Refuge. And it was basically a tallow forest monoculture. And so we had a contractor come out with one of these things and basically just cleared all the land. And it looked like this. So you can see it was a tallow forest and there wasn't much, you know, there other than invasives, and we cleared it out. And lo and behold, what popped up was a really nice prairie, and we didn't do anything to it. It was simply in the seed bank and just came up all on its own. I mean, there is definitely some continual, you know, invasions that we have of McCartney rose and tallow and things of that kind. But honestly, it was quite nice surprise to see what actually popped up. And so we regularly mow it and maintain it to keep it a prairie ecosystem. Next, I'll talk about some of our wetland creation enhancement. Our most recent event was here at our Kemah property, where we have excavated sort of a swale around our building, and we went through a wetland mitigation bank, and one of our partners that we utilize a lot for a lot of our projects, and he let us harvest wetland plants, and that is our conservation team out there collecting, and we brought it back to our Kemah property. Oh, look, and there's our marsh, I think that's marshmallow. No, and then some of the Sagittaria and the Thalia, all kinds of good wetland plants. And we brought it back and planted it in our swales, and it looked so skimpy at first. I was a little dismayed, but now it is a flourishing wetland. It took really well, and I was very, very, very happy with the results. Another one of our wetland enhancements projects, which Matt Singer led on this, was at Turtle Bayou Nature Preserve. This is actually I think I saw one of the questions popped up. This is one of our only public properties. So this is owned by the Chambers County Navigation District, and it is situated north of Lake Anahuac and off of Turtle Bayou. And what this is it's about, I think it's like 400 acres of recreational land. We've got bird observation towers, hiking trails, boardwalk, and it's still a work in progress. Every year I'm adding some more things to it for people to recreate. And we've got an angler kayak launch. It needs some repair, but you know, a little bit of love and a little bit of our friends from the Master Naturalists help keep it maintained well enough. So this was actually where we put in a water control structure, and it seemed like a very dirty job. I don't know about you, but that water is snake and alligator infested. So I would be the guy standing there on dry ground if it were me. But what it does is it impounded some of the water that flowed through this property into Lake Anahuac, and it looks something like that as the final result. And so you can see in this next picture, the vegetation is now transitioning from once was sort of a wet prairie system to an actual wetland. So this just was installed August of 2019. And so we took these pictures last summer in 2020, and you can see that the structure is maintaining and impounding the water, and the vegetation is slowly transitioning into a wetland system. And so I'll briefly talk about some of our forestation projects. We do mostly prairie restoration, and we did a little bit of forestation on our Kemah property, primarily because if you haven't seen it yet, 146 is right in front of our driveway. And so we're sort of trying to get a visual and sound barrier between us and the highway. But we hired some contractors to put in some native trees, and we've also put in, I guess, within a 365-day period, beginning, I guess it was last March, we have put in the ground 749 native shrubs and trees on our Kemah property. And this is just a few pictures of some of the contract work. So we put in some normal cedar elm, blue mist flower, wax myrtles, all kinds of good stuff. And so, like Haille was mentioning, is that if you're interested in volunteering, that is a real, a big, strong asset to GBF. Our background is not just you guys, you were the ones out there doing all the heavy lifting. And in this case, we have all of our volunteers planting those 749 trees. We've had boardwalk put in at Turtle Bayou. We have Boy Scouts doing some land stewardship where they're just with hand saws and hand tools and out there and trying to convert what is now turning into a woodland back into a prairie ecosystem. So we want to thank all of our local volunteers and our master naturalists, our government agencies, as Boy Scouts and the college spring break groups and corporate volunteer events that do so much hard work for us. And so if you are interested, like Haille had mentioned, you can contact me through my email. We've just recently put in a pollinator garden, that top picture on the left. That was an Eagle Scout project, and they just put seed in it last week. If you're interested in helping us maintain anything like that, we are more than happy to have your support. There's also our nursery and eco center in Baytown that we will be using a whole bunch now. We could definitely use some extra volunteers to help, weed out the weeds in the pots and do the regular watering and things of that kind. Or if you just simply want to harvest some seed for us to use in our future restoration projects and collect trash, you just give me a holler and we would be happy to have your support. And with that, that's all I have. Haille, do you have anything you want to add?
Just thank you to everybody for inviting us to be here today, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have.
This is Helen again. One of the questions was what kind of prep work? Could you expand a little bit on the preparation that you did on the Robbins Prairie?
Yeah, so we mowed it down pretty short, and then we tilled the soil with a rotary tiller, and then that was it. The soil organic matter looked good to me, and we didn't amend it with anything. So we're hopeful that we're going to have a really nice prairie here come up in the next few years.
Amazing how fast they come back. Another question, and I don't know if you're the right ones for this, but you could probably speak. Galveston Bay Foundation, I guess, has a position on the Ike Dike.
Yeah, I would suggest reaching out to Scott Jones with Galveston Bay Foundation. He's our advocacy director and can give you our official stance on it. And he is the one doing all the research and attending all the public meetings on that issue. But it's definitely something we're involved in.
And I think there's a statement on the website if somebody wants to
Yes.
follow up on the Ike
Correct.
Dike.
And if you go to our website under staff, you can find his contact information, and he's always happy to discuss that.
Who created the map for land conservation hotspots on your habitat?
We created the map of land conservation hotspots. Bear with me 1 second. There we go. IRNR, what is that? I got this figure from Matt Singer, and so it's Texas A&M. Yeah, Texas A&M.
Yeah, I've seen it before, so I think it's pretty common. Another person wanted to know if you had use of the California bulrush plant. I don't even know what that is, so hopefully you could tell me.
Yes, we use that. I think we have a little bit. It didn't take too well in our ponds, but we did plant that in our ponds. There is some. It's just a small colony.
I do believe we did some work in the past with Armand Bayou Nature Center, planting bulrush there in Armand Bayou to help do some freshwater wetland restoration many years ago.
Okay, I have just more on the California bulrush. We are cleaning out our pond of California bulrush and would love to have someone use those plants. They're too aggressive for our little pond.
I will take it.
Okay, so we'll be in touch, Ricci.
Great, great.
Thank you.
Okay, the question that says, can I plant marsh grass in the riprap?
Yeah.
I guess it depends on how compact that riprap is. The pictures I was showing, sometimes the grass will grow up in there, but we're usually planting behind it, so shoreward. But I mean, basically that marsh grass will grow as long as it's at the right elevation. So basically not too flooded and also not too dry. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Okay. Well, I want to thank our speakers.
can't wait to see y'all out in the marsh sometime soon.